Now I shall sing the second kingdom, there where the soul of man is cleansed, made worthy to ascend to heaven. So that is one of the opening tercets of the Purgatorio. And here I would like to have a few introductory observations about what purgatory means. It's part of Catholic dogma as a place where souls go after death. So there's in the eschatology, which is the fancy word for that which happens at the end of one's life and at the end of the world, the doctrine of the last things. You have traditionally four last things: death, judgment, heaven, hell. And that's how it goes. At death, according to Catholic dogma, there's an individual judgment, and one enters upon the afterlife that befits the life one has led. And if one has lived a saintly life, then one goes to heaven. If one has lived a life in rebellion against God, one goes to hell. And if one has lived a life that is not set against God, but is not saintly, that is the life most of us probably lead, there's a place called purgatory for the cleansing of our sins. And that's the realm that Dante is the first one really to fully imagine. It was a developing kind of hypothesis in the theological tradition to try to make sense of this conundrum that I think we all have kind of access to, in terms of this notion that most of us probably haven't got the love thing down very well, that our ability to love is still not where it ought to be by the time we die. So that's where purgatory comes in. It's a place where the punishments are not there as vengeance. It is there as a means of purification and of improvement. So even though we have the same kind of mechanism, the contrapasso mechanism, that is, the punishment fits the crime, it's completely different in this realm of the afterlife, because everyone that we see in this realm is eventually going to make it into the ranks of the blessed. So they all suffer in hope, as it were. So that's a general eschatological background, and I'm happy to field questions on that later. There's some anthropological, and this is the way we use that word, not in the kind of university course listening, but in philosophy and theology. Anthropology refers to the structure of the human person. And today's reading, which I know was probably the longest one, and I know it was a lot, we get to the central cantos of the whole Commedia. Because there are 100 cantos, Canto 16 plus the 34 that make up the Inferno, that puts us at number 50. So 16 and 17 are the two middle cantos. 17 would be smack in the middle of the 33 cantos of the Purgatory proper. And then 18 is a continuation of Virgil's discussion of love that he began in 17. So you have at the very center of the Commedia these the discourse given by Marco Lombardo about free will. Then you have Virgil's two disquisitions on love in 17 and 18. And it's not an accident that Dante the Poet has put these discourses at the very heart of things. So to kind of prepare us, we will spend time with those long speeches. This is the first time really where we get so much philosophical poetry, and we'll see how you all reacted to that much heavy sledding. It is a largely Thomistic anthropology, that is an anthropology that derives from the thought of Thomas Aquinas, but I don't think that it's simply Thomistic. It is also Augustinian. And if there are some very difficult passages in Canto 18 about primal will, and it's relation that can never err, that there's a fundamental yearning in us for the good, and that's simply inerrant. And that, I would think, has to do with the Augustinian sense of the heart, the deep heart in us that wants, that's restless and can only rest in God. But then beyond, so that's an Augustinian point, that heart that is deeper than the faculties. The faculties, or the powers of the soul, are, in the classic Thomistic narrative, you've got the appetites. Well, first, you've got the vegetative powers, which we share with the plants. You've got the sensitive powers, which we share with other animals. So the appetites that are stimulated by our sense perception. When we see something that is pleasing, we go for that. We incline towards that. And that inclination is appetite. Broadly speaking, it's love. That's what Virgil says, is that everything inclines towards that which would be good for it. And that's love, desire. But the human animal is different from other animals because besides the vegetative and the sensitive, we have the rational powers. And the rational powers are two. That is the intellect, or reason, intellect and reason really, but and there's a precision to be made there. And the will. It's very important in understanding this kind of worldview to recognize that the will is not a force that hangs out on its own. It is, in Thomas's definition, the will is rational appetite. That is, the way that when we see something or smell something that's pleasing, we incline with our sense appetites towards that thing. When we reason, when our eyes of our mind see something that is pleasing intellectually, then we incline towards that, and that inclination is called will. It's a very different way of thinking about will than the modern notion of the voluntaristic notion. That will is the source of libero arbitrio, that is free choice. And so free choice is basically what we think our will is. The medievals would distinguish between will and free choice. Free choice is something that ought to follow upon our reasonable apprehension of reality, the reasonable appetite that follows upon what we've apprehended of reality, and then we make a choice based on that. And free choice, of course, is what Marco Lombardo puts at the center of his discussion in Cantos XVI. So those are some coordinates. So a basic kind of quick overview of the plot. At the end of Inferno, Dante, the pilgrim, and Virgil are climbing up, probably along this underground river Lethe, the river Lethe will meet again on the top of Mount Purgatory. And they make it all the way to the other side of the world. The Antipodes from Jerusalem is Mount Purgatory. And it's not exactly clear, but the vision that Virgil gives at the end of Inferno is that when Satan, the first event in history is that Satan falls from heaven because of his prideful rebellion against God. And as we remember, we see him stuck in ice at the center of the world. So he falls towards the southern hemisphere and then pierces the center of the world and is stuck there. Above his head in the northern hemisphere is Jerusalem. Opposite his feet is Mount Purgatory. And somehow when he falls, that fall somehow creates the concavity of hell that we circled around, and also creates the mountain of Purgatory, which we're going to climb up. That mountain is immense. It peaks all the way above the sublunary sphere. So we're going to see that at the end, that the very top of the mountain reaches into the heavens, as it were. We've seen this mountain already when Ulysses describes his final voyage, that he had convinced his crewmates to go out for one last great adventure, and he'd seen this mountain in the distance, and then a great wind sank the ship. So where Ulysses has failed, the poet, this pilgrim Dante, is going to succeed. He's going to get to Purgatory and is going to describe it for us. So on Easter Sunday morning, again, Dante's playing with the dates. He both implies that the journey begins on March 25th, the Annunciation, and on Holy Thursday. They're both true for him. He wants the symbolic power of both there. But in 1300, this is Easter morning, when they emerge, Virgil and the pilgrim emerge from the underworld, having climbed all the way up through the earth, and they're facing, if you picture it, they're facing westward towards the mountains. So somehow that the hole that lets them up, they're facing this way, and then they're going to look, the sun is going to rise behind the two of them. To his left, the pilgrim sees 4 stars that he says the widowed north has not seen since Adam and Eve. And these 4 stars, it could be the Southern Cross, though we're not sure that he knew anything about the star charts of the South. It all has to do with whether he read Marco Polo's accounts. But the 4 stars clearly are symbolic of the acquired virtues, the 4 cardinal virtues. And those cardinal virtues go back to that anthropological discussion. So we have 4 basic faculties or powers, according to Aquinas. We have the 2 sense appetites. One appetite, which is simply simple appetite for the thing that looks attractive, and the virtue that forms that in a good way, that makes us desire the right things, is temperance. We have an appetite that gets us to fight for the good that's difficult to get to, and that's the irascible appetite, and that gets, so the concupiscible appetite gets formed by temperance. The irascible appetite gets formed by courage or fortitude. Our will gets formed by justice, and our intellect our reason gets formed by prudence. So those are the 4 acquired virtues. If we acquire those virtues in our life, that gets us a long way towards the pre-lapsarian state, the state of humanity before the fall. That's part of what Dante the Poet is getting us to think about, is how human innocence relates to all the moral effort it takes to become virtuous. So that's right there, right on the first page. So that's, it's, again, as I say, why I think the Commedia is the supreme work of art, is that I don't think any other work has so much density of meaning or density of form, frankly. And that's, we could real literally go on hours and hours with these pages. All right, so they're facing a mountain that peaks above the earthly atmosphere. Then they meet, again, this is one of the most surprising things, and probably the most surprising thing in the Commedia, and that they meet the warden of the mountain, who is Cato, who committed suicide in 46 BC in North Africa. He was one of the Republican opponents of Julius Caesar, and he could not face being ruled by a tyrant or being pardoned by a tyrant. So whatever we thought about the rules of the game that Dante the Poet, again distinguishing that force from Dante the narrator and Dante the pilgrim, Dante the Poet has given us all kinds of things to wrestle with in the Inferno. Well, he's thrown something huge at us at the very beginning of the Purgatorio, something that tells us we have to rethink everything, including the status of Virgil. And that's going to be a continuing theme throughout this canticle. What about Virgil? Why is he condemned to hell? Cato dies before Christ, and that's usually a ticket to hell, or at least limbo, unless you were a Hebrew or a Jew. He commits suicide, which technically is a mortal sin. So, and we've seen Pierre de la Vigne represent that. But then suicide is a very complicated issue in Dante, and there's reason to believe that, in fact, he had suicidal thoughts in his midlife crisis. He gives all kinds of indications of that. I mean, you see in Limbo, in the first circle, in the circle with Francesca, you see Dido, right, who commits suicide because Aeneas leaves her on his mission, as he proceeds with his mission. So Dante the poet has a very subtle sense of where the sins all line up and what sin actually defines us. Well, Cato, the suicide, the pagan suicide, is right there. He's the warden of the mountain, and he's going to be saved. And that's what it means for him to be there on the other side of the world. So that one fact is something that's worth meditating upon, and we'll have to do that a lot. The first canto ends with Virgil having been instructed by Cato to do this. Virgil basically does a rite of baptism, washes off the grime of hell from the pilgrim's face, and then he girds him. Remember, the pilgrim had used his belt to lure Garion from the depths so that they could go from the 7th circle of hell down to the 8th circle of Malebolge. So it's a very interesting symbolic game that's being played here. So now he doesn't have a belt, and so on his journey he needs to be girded, and he's going to be girded with a reed that's going to be plucked from the very margin of Mount Purgatory. And there he girded me as pleased another, which is clearly, even though it's not in the Hollander notes, it's clearly a reference to the end of the Gospel of John, where Peter asks, what about John? What's going to happen to him? And Jesus says that don't you worry about that. That's for me to care about. You as a young man, Peter, you dressed as you wanted, you went where you wanted. When you are old, someone else will dress you and will lead you where you do not want to go. And that's the reference here. So something about the journey of purgation requires us to surrender control. We're no longer in charge of the course of things. We have then, the next event is an angelic ferry coming from Ostia, which is the port of Rome, carrying souls that have been milling around there. So one of the great innovations that Dante the poet is presenting us with is that not only is he going to construct the imaginal world of purgatory for us, he's going to present us with two things that are new. Just as he created the world of the neutrals in the first circle of hell, he's going to, or right inside the gate there, here he's going to talk about a pre-anti-purgatory. That is, somehow the souls of those who die have to wait, who are going to be purged. They have to wait for an angel to select them and ferry them across the world to the mountain of purgatory. They meet Casella, who is a person that clearly Dante knew in life, who seems to have set Dante's poetry to music, and he sings one of those songs. But the question is, Casella, how are you here so fast, basically? And that's because Boniface VIII, the great bête noire of Dante, without whom Dante would not have been exiled, Boniface VIII declared a Jubilee year in 1300, and that helped set more souls free and to go along on their journey. So that's an interesting thing, that, and even putting Ostia there as the portal of the other world means that Rome is still very much the center of Dante's thoughts. Rome is always the center of his thoughts. Okay, so they meet Casella. He starts singing one of Dante's poems, and Cato comes along, who's the rigid moralist, and says, "Hey, you got to get on your way. You're wasting time here. Get up the mountain." And so they start climbing. Part of the drama of the second canticle is where's the opening up the mountain face, and because it's so steep, where are the places where they can climb up? They're going to climb up. They're going to meet other people in what's called anti-purgatory. That is, this isn't properly purgatory. We don't get to purgatory proper until book 9, and that's very structurally, canto 9. That's parallel to the fact we don't get to the city of Dis, the gates of the city of Dis, till canto 9 in the Inferno. You'll see that there are structural parallels that the poet wants us to track. So before that, you meet the excommunicated and the late repentant. That is, along the lower reaches of the mountain, before you get to the gate of purgatory proper, you meet these souls that either died excommunicated, such as Manfred. And that's very interesting because, and this shows you that there's something about the the Catholicity, as it were, little c Catholicity of Dante's spirit, where again, in hell he was equal opportunity condemner, whereas you saw Guelphs and Ghibellines and white and black Guelphs in hell equally sharing punishment. Well, here you're going to find Guelphs and Ghibellines, black and white Guelphs, on the way to salvation. And you're going to find here one of the excommunicated is Manfred, who's the illegitimate son of Frederick II, and he was killed at Benevento in 1266 at that battle. And that battle, so remember that Dante originally belonged to the Guelph party. Now, it's clear in today's reading that he's in some weird way become Ghibelline. Now, it's in an ideological sense, and that's something we have to think through. But his party was always Guelph, and that meant Manfred being the imperial party, and one who was condemned to be executed by the Pope, right? So if you here's a pro-papal party person of Guelph, recognizing that a person that the Pope has condemned, in fact, is saved. And that means that Dante does not think that the papal power is as supreme as it thinks it is. I think that's an important point for Catholics to look at. Manfred says, after my body was riven by 2 mortal blows at Benevento, I turned in tears to him who freely pardons. Horrible were my sins, but infinite goodness with wide open arms receives whoever turns to it. All right, well, I don't want to spend more time going. You meet other very important personages, including a lot of rulers who dwell in the Valley of the Princes, and there's a very interesting kind of replay of the temptation scene in the Garden of Eden there. In a way, the whole mountain is Eden. They get to the gate of Purgatory, and finally we're there seeing that the 7 deadly sins structure those terraces, and it's very regular from there on out. The first terrace is pride, the next terrace is envy, the next terrace is wrath, and the next one is sloth, and that's where we end up. So I'm going to leave it at that, and then I will read the questions that I had laid out, which they're good questions. What decisions concerning purgatory might unsettle assumptions we had made based on Dante the Poet's construction of hell? What evidence might you cite to show that Dante is not simply settling scores based on his own partisan past? Now that we have 2 canticles before us, we can begin to compare. For example, Canto 6 of each canticle is focused on politics. How does Sordello's invective interact with what we heard from Ciacco in the Inferno? Does Dante places Marco Lombardo's discourse on liberty and law at the center of the entire comedy? Why? And finally, what explains the structure of Mount Purgatory? How does Dante show love to be the pattern in secret motor?